The boy is found on the floor of an abandoned building in Greenwich Village. No wallet, no identification, no one who recognizes his face. New York City buries him in a pauper's grave, just another nameless drifter the city swallowed whole. But this was no ordinary man. This was the golden-haired child whose voice filled living rooms across America. The boy Walt Disney himself called his greatest discovery. The face that launched 1,000 lunchboxes, posters, and dreams. So how does the most beloved child star in Hollywood history end up dying alone, unidentified, in a condemned building? And why did it take 2 years for anyone to even try to find out who he was? His name was Bobby Driscoll, and from the very beginning the world took more from him than it ever gave back. Bobby was born in 1937 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the only child of Cletus and Isabel Driscoll. His father was a quiet working man. His mother was devoted. By all accounts, it was a normal, modest life. But normalcy has a way of shattering without warning. When Bobby was still very young, his father lost his job. The family packed everything they owned and drove west to California, chasing the dream that swallowed so many American families whole. They arrived in Los Angeles with almost nothing. A new city, no connections, no safety net. Just hope and desperation wearing the same face. It was there that someone noticed Bobby. A casting agent spotted the bright-eyed, golden-haired boy and told his parents he had something special, something the camera would love. His mother believed it. His father had no better options. And just like that, before Bobby was old enough to understand what was happening, his childhood was handed over to Hollywood. He was 5 years old. But here is what nobody tells you about child stardom. The lights are real. The cameras are real. The contracts are real. The childhood is not. Bobby spent his earliest years not in schoolyards or sandboxes, but on studio lots, surrounded by adults whose livelihoods depended on how well he performed. Every smile was directed. Every tear was scheduled. Every moment of joy existed to serve someone else's story. And then came the diagnosis that would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his life. At a young age, Bobby developed severe acne. A condition that sounds minor until you understand what it meant for a child whose entire value had been placed in his face. Hollywood had sold America on Bobby Driscoll's perfect, angelic appearance. When that appearance began to change, naturally, the way every human face changes, the studio did not see a child growing up. They saw a liability. No one sat Bobby down and explained what was happening. No one told him his worth as a human being had nothing to do with his skin. Instead, the calls slowed. The auditions stopped. The adults around him, the same ones who had smiled and fussed over him for years, quietly began to look away. He was still a child, and he was already being discarded, but before the fall came the glory. And the glory was blinding. In 1949, Walt Disney personally selected Bobby Driscoll for the lead role in Treasure Island. It was the studio's first live-action feature film. Disney told reporters Bobby was the finest young actor he had ever seen. The world agreed. The film was a massive hit. Then came something even bigger. Disney cast Bobby as the voice and the physical model of Peter Pan. The boy who never grows up. The child who flies. It was the most iconic animated role in Hollywood history, and Bobby Driscoll was its beating heart. His face, his movements, his voice, all captured frame by Disney animators who studied him like he was something rare and precious. For one brief, luminous moment, Bobby Driscoll was Peter Pan. And then Walt Disney dropped him, not quietly, not kindly. Bobby's mother received a form letter from the studio. A standard contract termination notice, the kind sent to suppliers and vendors. The reason given was the acne. Disney's people reportedly told the family that Bobby's skin made him unsuitable for close-up work. He was 15 years old. The boy whose face had been traced by Disney animators, immortalized forever as the child who never grows up, was discarded because his face had the audacity to grow up. But Bobby refused to stop believing. He enrolled in acting classes. He fought his way back. By his late teens, he had landed a role in The Window, a psychological thriller that earned him a Juvenile Academy Award. Critics called his performance stunning. Doors began to open again. He stood at the edge of a real adult career. Then the drugs found him, or perhaps, given everything, he found them first. By his early 20s, Bobby was using heroin. The adults who had profited from his talent for years were nowhere to be found. The studio system that had consumed his childhood offered no treatment, no support, no safety net. Bobby was arrested, then arrested again, Each arrest made the Hollywood trades. Each headline closed another door. The boy the world had once called magical was now a cautionary tale whispered at studio parties. And still no one asked how he got there. Act 4, The Suspicious Web. Here is where the story stops being sad and starts being something darker. Bobby Driscoll did not fall through the cracks by accident. The machinery that built him was the same machinery that destroyed him. And certain men, very specific men, made very deliberate choices along the way. Start with Walt Disney himself. Disney was not a passive figure in Bobby's life. He was hands-on, controlling, and deeply involved in the image his child stars projected. Former employees described Disney's studio as operating less like a creative enterprise and more like a corporation managing assets. Child actors were assets. When an asset depreciated, it was replaced. But Disney's behavior toward Bobby went beyond cold business logic. When Bobby was at his lowest, arrested, addicted, desperate, he reportedly reached out to the Disney studio for help. He had given them Peter Pan. He had given them his face, his voice, his childhood. He asked for assistance finding work, any work. The studio did not respond. But who else was watching Bobby's collapse and doing nothing? The Screen Actors Guild had protections in place for adult performers. But child actors in the 1940s and 1950s existed in a legal gray zone. There were no mandatory trust accounts, no required counseling, no limits on working hours that were consistently enforced. The men who ran the guild knew this. The studio executives knew this. The agents knew this. They built the system that way on purpose. And then there was Bobby's own agent, a man who collected 10% of every dollar Bobby earned throughout his peak years. When Bobby's earning power collapsed, the agent moved on to newer, younger clients. No farewell, no referral, no phone call. Did anyone in Bobby's orbit ever genuinely act in his interest, or were they all, every single one of them, only ever acting in their own? That question has never been answered, and it gets more uncomfortable from here. Bobby's final years placed him inside the New York underground art scene of the 1960s. He moved in circles connected to Andy Warhol's factory, a world soaked in drugs, chaos, and the deliberate exploitation of damaged, beautiful people. Several figures from that world later admitted they knew Bobby, knew he was struggling, knew who he had been. Not one of them tried to help him. Was Bobby Driscoll simply a man who made terrible choices, or was he a person so thoroughly stripped of every protective structure that terrible choices became the only ones available to him? The men who could answer that are either dead or silent. But if you want to understand what truly happened to Bobby Driscoll, you have to look directly at the studio system itself, not as a concept. As a machine with specific moving parts that crushed a specific child in a specific sequence of events. Here is what they actually did. When Bobby was signed to RKO Pictures as a young boy, no one established a protected trust account for his earnings. The Coogan Law, passed in 1939 specifically to protect child actors after Jackie Coogan discovered his mother and stepfather had spent his entire fortune, should have safeguarded Bobby's money. But the law had enormous loopholes. Studios and unscrupulous parents could still drain a child's earnings through expenses and management fees before a single dollar reached a protected account. By the time Bobby was an adult, the money was gone. Every dollar he had earned as Hollywood's golden child, the Treasure Island fees, the Peter Pan sessions, the merchandising that put his face on products across America, had evaporated. Bobby Driscoll entered adulthood with no savings, no safety net, and no understanding of how it had happened. But the financial theft was not even the cruelest part. When Bobby's drug arrests became public, the studios did something deliberate and precise. They did not stay silent. They did not protect him. Instead, studio publicists quietly fed stories to the Hollywood trade press, framing Bobby's addiction not as the predictable collapse of a traumatized child star with no support system, but as a personal moral failing. A character defect, something that had always been inside him. They made the public blame Bobby for what the industry had done to Bobby. The strategy was effective and coldly calculated. It redirected every question away from the studios and toward the broken young man himself. Why was he addicted? Because he was weak. Why had his career collapsed? Because he had squandered his gift. Why was he struggling? Because something was fundamentally wrong with him. Not one outlet asked who had taken his money. Not one reporter asked what psychological support had been provided to a child who spent his entire formative years as a performing asset. Not one editor ran the story of a system that consumed children and discarded them before they were old enough to vote. The narrative was set. Bobby Driscoll was a tragedy of his own making. And Walt Disney, the man who had pressed Bobby's very face into animation cells, who had made hundreds of millions from the image of this child, released a statement about Peter Pan that never once mentioned Bobby Driscoll by name. Not once he had been erased from his own story. ACT 6, Secret Within a Secret. You think you now understand what happened to Bobby Driscoll. You do not. Because in 1969, 2 years after Bobby's body was found in that abandoned Greenwich Village tenement, a New York City clerk ran his fingerprints through a routine database check. And the results changed everything. The fingerprints matched. Bobby Driscoll had been identified. His mother, still alive, still waiting, was finally notified that her son was dead. She had spent 2 years not knowing. 2 years wondering where her boy had gone. 2 years of silence from a city that had processed her son's corpse and filed it under John Doe without a second thought. But here is what nobody followed up on. Among Bobby's few remaining possessions, recovered from the abandoned building where he died, were several paintings. Unfinished, raw, deeply personal, Bobby had been painting in his final years, trying in the only way left available to him to make something real in a life that had been built entirely on performance and illusion. Those paintings disappeared. No estate claimed them. No museum cataloged them. No auction house ever listed them. For a man with no money and no family nearby, Bobby technically died intestate, meaning his possessions should have passed through a formal legal process. They did not. So who took the paintings, and why? There is one name that surfaces in the margins of this story, a name connected to the New York underground art world Bobby had been moving through in his final years. A dealer, a collector. A man who was known to acquire work from artists who were too damaged or too desperate to negotiate fair terms. That man died in 1987. His estate was never fully inventoried. His private collection was distributed quietly among buyers whose names were never made public. Whatever Bobby Driscoll created in his final desperate years, whatever truth he may have pressed into those canvases, is gone. Or it is hanging on someone's wall right now, in a private home, in a locked room, completely unattributed. And here is the detail that makes this impossible to dismiss. Bobby had told at least one acquaintance in his final months that he was working on something. Not just paintings, writing. He called it, according to this one surviving account, his version of the story. He said he was finally going to tell what had really happened to him, what had really been done. That document has never been found. Did Bobby Driscoll spend his last months trying to tell the truth about Hollywood's treatment of its child stars? Did someone know he was writing it? And is it a coincidence that a man with that kind of story to tell died alone and unidentified, in a city where no one came looking for him for 2 full years? The only person who could answer that question with certainty pressed his last breath into the cold floor of an abandoned building in 1968, and took everything he knew with him. ACT 7. Unresolved ending plus CTA. So what do we actually know? We know Bobby Driscoll died alone. We know he was buried in a pauper's grave under a number, not a name. We know the studio that made hundreds of millions from his face, and his voice never once came looking for him. We know his money vanished. We know his paintings vanished. We know his writing vanished. And we know that Peter Pan, the film built on Bobby's body, Bobby's voice, Bobby's childhood, is still selling. Right now, today, on Disney+. In 2014, Disney quietly added Bobby Driscoll's name to the credits of Peter Pan. 45 years after his death, 60 years after the film was made, no press release, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of what had been done to him, just a name slipped in. As if that settled anything, it does not settle anything. Here is what the strongest evidence suggests. Bobby Driscoll was not simply a casualty of addiction. He was a child who was financially stripped, psychologically abandoned, publicly shamed, and then erased by a system that had extracted everything of value from him before he was old enough to protect himself. The evidence for that is overwhelming and documented. But here is where the evidence stops. We do not know what happened to his paintings. We do not know whether his writing ever existed beyond one second-hand account from a single unnamed acquaintance. We do not know whether anyone in his final circle knew who he was and chose to say nothing. We do not know whether his death was as accidental as the official record suggests. The medical examiner ruled his cause of death as heart failure, consistent with prolonged drug use. That finding was never seriously challenged. There was no investigation, there was no inquest, there was barely a newspaper story. A child who had once been photographed with Walt Disney. A boy whose face had been on the front page of every entertainment publication in America. Dead at 31, and the city of New York spent less than 48 hours processing his case before moving on. Does that feel right to you? Because it has never felt right to the people who have spent decades trying to piece together the final chapter of Bobby Driscoll's life. Researchers, film historians, former child actors who recognized in Bobby's story the outlines of their own. They have filed requests, chased leads, located former acquaintances from the factory years. Every trail goes cold in the same place. Greenwich Village. 1968. A building that no longer exists, on a street that has been completely rebuilt. The physical evidence is gone. The witnesses are gone. The man himself, the boy Walt Disney called his greatest discovery, is buried in a grave on Hart Island, New York's Potter's Field. For decades his grave was unmarked. A number in a ledger. The full truth of what happened to Bobby Driscoll, what was done to him, what he knew, what he was trying to say in those final months, may never be known. Some stories do not end. They just stop. If this story stayed with you, if Bobby's name deserves to be remembered, subscribe and hit the bell. Hundreds more stories like this are waiting for you. Stories of people the world used up and forgot. We do not forget them here. We do not forget them here.